One night in the darkness, a woman falls down the stairs, and her dog watches, barking. Was it an accident? Or was a ruthless killer executing a sinister plan? The night was thick with fog, the kind that settled like a blanket over the countryside, muffling even the faintest of sounds. Emily Arundel stood at the top of the grand staircase in her ancient Berkshire mansion, her frail figure silhouetted by the dim light of a single candle. Her eyes, sharp yet filled with an air of unease, seemed to peer into the oppressive darkness below, as though searching for something or someone she couldn't quite place. The old house creaked and groaned under the weight of its age, and the faint, eerie whisper of the wind outside seemed to carry with it a warning. But what that warning was, Emily couldn't decipher. She had always felt uneasy in this house, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick, oppressive, as if something was lurking just out of sight. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, seemed to amplify the growing tension in the room. Bob, her loyal fox terrier, stood by her side, his ears pricked, his small body trembling slightly in the charged atmosphere. Emily's heart raced as her grip tightened on the banister, her knuckles turning white. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a sense of impending doom that gnawed at her. Then, as if the house itself had decided to play a cruel trick on her, the floor beneath her seemed to shift. Her foot slipped. A small gasp escaped her lips before she tumbled forward, her body spiraling downward, helpless in its descent. She crashed violently against the stone steps, the sound of her fall echoing through the empty halls, a final scream of despair swallowed by the thick fog outside. Bob barked fiercely, his shrill cries piercing the silence, as if calling for help. His frantic paws scraped the ground, circling his fallen mistress. Emily lay motionless at the base of the stairs, her eyes wide open but unseeing, staring blankly into the void. The night continued its eerie silence, broken only by the sound of Bob's frantic barking. And then, the mansion fell still, the kind of stillness that spoke volumes of secrets long buried. The next morning, a letter was hastily written, its words shaky yet desperate. Emily's handwriting, though once steady and proud, trembled with the weight of fear and suspicion. In it, she addressed the letter to none other than the famous detective Hercule Poirot. "I fear for my life. I believe someone in my household wishes to see me dead. I know this sounds impossible, but I cannot ignore what I have seen, what I have felt. I beg you to come quickly, before it is too late." The letter was sent off, but Emily never saw the reply. Her body was found the next day, cold and lifeless, with no signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. The physicians whispered of liver disease, but the truth seemed far darker. And the questions, they lingered, unanswered. Cliffhanger. What secrets does this mansion hold? What malevolent force is at work within these walls? Who wanted Emily Arundel dead? The arrival. Weeks had passed since Emily Arundel's desperate letter had been sent. The ink on the paper had barely dried when Hercule Poirot received it, his sharp eyes scanning the words carefully, his mind already working at full speed. The letter spoke of fear, of someone in the household wanting to kill Emily, a claim so serious that it could not be taken lightly. He had, of course, read many strange letters in his time, but there was something in Emily's words that made him take immediate action. Without hesitation, Poirot packed his bags and made arrangements to leave, Captain Hastings at his side, always the ever-loyal companion. As the two men traveled through the damp, fog-laden streets, their minds were heavy with thoughts of what awaited them at the Arundel estate. The journey had been long, but Poirot remained silent, lost in thought. Hastings, noticing Poirot's preoccupation, didn't press him. Poirot's mind was always a labyrinth of deduction, each twist and turn leading him closer to a truth only he could see. Upon arriving at the grand Arundel mansion, Poirot was struck by the eerie stillness that hung in the air. The once proud home now appeared neglected, as if time itself had forgotten to grace its walls. Poirot and Hastings were led inside by the housekeeper, whose face was drawn, as though she too sensed the darkness that had taken root here. Emily Arundel "Where is she?" Poirot inquired, his voice calm yet sharp with intent. The housekeeper's eyes flickered nervously before she answered, her voice barely a whisper. She has passed away, Monsieur Poirot." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered, his mind already racing to piece together the truth. He turned to the family physician, Dr. Granger, who stood nearby, an expression of professional detachment masking the sorrow in his eyes. "Her death," Dr. Granger began, his tone measured, "was the result of liver disease. A long battle. We did everything we could." Poirot studied the physician intently, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And yet, you cannot be sure, can you, mon ami?" he said, his voice calm but laced with the sharpness of suspicion. Dr. Granger seemed taken aback by the detective's directness. He cleared his throat. It was expected. She had been unwell for some time. The symptoms were clear. "Ah," Poirot replied softly, his fingers tapping against his chin as he pondered. "The symptoms, but not the cause, perhaps." Hastings watched Poirot, perplexed by the detective's insistence on uncertainty. He, too, had seen the state of the house and the solemn air hanging over the family. But Poirot wasn't satisfied with the doctor's diagnosis. Something was off, something hidden beneath the surface. Poirot moved quietly through the house, examining every detail, every small inconsistency, as his sharp mind sought out answers. He asked questions, each one calculated, probing beneath the surface of the seemingly innocuous. Emily's death, it seemed, was far from natural. There were signs, faint, almost imperceptible, that someone had gone to great lengths to cover up something darker, something more sinister. As Poirot stepped into Emily's room, a shiver ran down his spine. There was an unnatural stillness to the room, an unease in the air that seemed to cling to everything: the heavy curtains, the antique furniture, the scent of lavender in the air. Poirot's gaze landed on a small object near the window, a broken glass, its jagged edges catching the light in an unsettling way. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks on the body. Yet, Poirot's trained eyes saw what others missed: the faintest smear of something dark near the glass. "What is this, I wonder?" Poirot muttered to himself, picking up the glass carefully with his gloved hands. Hastings, who had followed Poirot into the room, was visibly shaken by the scene. "Do you think she was murdered, Poirot?" Poirot paused for a long moment, his eyes scanning the room once more. The mystery was deepening, layers upon layers of deception hidden behind the scenes. Emily's sudden death, the letter, the strange marks, the doctor's quick diagnosis, all of it was part of something much larger. He turned to Hastings, his voice low but filled with certainty. "It is too soon to say, mon ami, but there is much more to this than liver disease. I am certain of that." The air in the room grew colder, heavier. Poirot stood there, his mind racing as he pieced together the puzzle in front of him. He knew the truth was hiding just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But as he stood in Emily's room, one thing was certain: this was no ordinary death. Cliffhanger. Was this truly a natural death, or is something far darker, more sinister at play? The investigation begins. The air in the Arundel mansion had grown colder since Poirot's arrival, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As he began his investigation, Poirot knew that the truth would not come easily. There was something hidden in the shadows of this grand estate, something dark that lurked in the hearts of Emily's family. Poirot sat in the drawing room, his sharp eyes flicking from one relative to another as he prepared to speak with them. These were the people who had been closest to Emily, and yet they were also the most likely to have motives. The scene was set, the game was afoot, and Poirot's every instinct was on high alert. Charles, the charming nephew, with a shady past. Charles Arundel entered the room with an air of effortless charm. His clothes were well-tailored, his smile smooth, and his demeanor seemingly pleasant. But there was something about him that didn't sit right with Poirot. The man exuded a polished confidence, but beneath that was the unmistakable scent of desperation. He was broke, desperately broke, and his charming exterior masked a man who had been living off others for too long. "I'm sorry for your loss, Monsieur Poirot," Charles said with a bow, though his eyes avoided Poirot's, his nervous habit betraying him. Poirot studied Charles for a moment, his mind working as he examined the man's every movement. Charles's financial ruin, his sudden but steady presence in Emily's life, and the vague whispers of past indiscretions were all pieces of the puzzle. Poirot had read between the lines of the family's history and had no illusions about Charles's true character. A man without resources, a man with debts to pay such a person, might go to great lengths to secure an inheritance. And yet, there was something more here, something Charles was hiding, something that Poirot had not yet uncovered. "Tell me, Charles," Poirot said, his voice smooth and disarming. "What was your relationship with your aunt? Was it close, or strained, perhaps?" Charles laughed, though the sound was hollow. "We were family, Monsieur Poirot. Close enough, I suppose. But, well, you know, money changes everything, doesn't it?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. Indeed, money does have that effect. Charles hesitated. Poirot knew he was holding back, but the question remained. Was it simply greed that had driven Charles, or was there something more sinister brewing beneath the surface? Teresa, the glamorous niece, with a penchant for danger. Next, Poirot met Teresa Arundel, a woman whose beauty was as dangerous as her nature. She entered the room with an undeniable air of sophistication, her attire elegant, her smile flirtatious. She moved with the grace of someone used to getting what they wanted, and Poirot could tell instantly that her charm was as sharp as a blade. "I trust you find the house to your liking, Monsieur Poirot," Teresa said, her voice as smooth as silk, laced with an undertone of calculation. "It's a bit of a tomb now, isn't it? A family buried under secrets, not all of them pleasant." Poirot leaned back in his chair, observing her intently. There was something unsettling about Teresa, a glamour that hid a far more dangerous, reckless side. Her penchant for excitement was no secret. She had lived a life of indulgence and flirtation, of running on the edge of danger, and perhaps of more serious indiscretions. She had often been seen in the company of men who were better left forgotten. The question was, what did she want from her aunt? Was she grieving, or was there something else at play here? "Tell me, Madame Arundel," Poirot asked, his voice calm yet probing. "Where were you the night your aunt passed?" Teresa's eyes flickered, her perfect smile never wavering. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, do you suspect me of something? I was at a party, a soirée, if you will, with friends. You know how it is. One needs to keep up appearances." Poirot did not respond immediately, but his eyes narrowed. The party, the friends, it all felt rehearsed, too neat. Teresa's gaze didn't meet his directly now, and that told Poirot everything he needed to know. There was a lie buried somewhere beneath her calculated charm. Bella, the troubled niece, trapped in an unhappy marriage. Finally, Poirot met Bella Arundel, the most sorrowful of Emily's nieces, whose heartache was evident in the way she carried herself. She was slender, delicate, and seemed to shrink into the shadows of the room, avoiding the light. Her gaze, too, was haunted, as though something she had seen in life had broken her, and she could never escape it. Poirot's gaze softened as he studied her, but he knew better than to be swayed by appearances. Bella's troubled marriage to her controlling Greek husband, Jacob Tanios, had been the subject of whispered gossip for years. Jacob was a man whose temper was as volatile as his wealth, and he had never hidden his disdain for Bella's family. The relationship between the two seemed to be one of manipulation and fear, with Bella trapped in a cage she couldn't escape. "Madame Bella," Poirot said gently, "I understand you have suffered. But what of your aunt? What was your relationship with her, and where were you the night of her passing?" Bella's eyes darted nervously, and her hands trembled slightly in her lap. I was at home," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jacob, he was with me." Poirot could see the lie in her eyes, but why was she lying? Was it out of fear of her husband, or was there something more to the story? Bella seemed to know more than she was letting on, and Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that her unease was tied to something darker, something that could very well involve her aunt's death. Cliffhanger. As Poirot surveyed the three suspects before him, his mind raced. Each one had a motive, each one a shadow hanging over them. But only one thing was certain. Emily's death was no accident. Someone in this room had orchestrated it, but who? Was it the charming yet desperate Charles, whose debts had led him to the brink? Was it the glamorous Teresa, whose reckless ambition was masked by beauty? Or was it Bella, the broken niece, whose marriage to a cruel man had left her a prisoner in her own life? Poirot's eyes lingered on them, the silence growing thicker with each passing second. He could feel the walls closing in. But the question remained, which one was the murderer? And more importantly, who would be next? Who is hiding the darkest secret of all, and what lengths will they go to in order to protect it? Poirot discovers Emily's changed will. The investigation had taken Poirot to many dark corners of the Arundel estate, but it was the discovery of Emily's newly altered will that truly sent a chill through his veins. After weeks of carefully observing the family, the servants, and the house itself, Poirot had uncovered fragments of an unsettling truth. He had known something was wrong from the start, the way Emily's relatives had reacted to her death, the anxious glances exchanged in the drawing room, the sharp undercurrents of resentment. But now, this new revelation opened a door to a much deeper, more dangerous conspiracy. Poirot sat in his study, a single candle flickering on the desk, his eyes scanning the will in front of him. It had been altered only weeks before Emily's sudden demise. What once had been a straightforward distribution of Emily's considerable fortune to her niece and nephew had changed dramatically. Emily Arundel had left everything to her quiet, unassuming companion, Minnie Lawson. Minnie, a meek woman in her late 40s, had spent years by Emily's side, her presence almost invisible. She had no family, no fortune, no claims to anything in the world except for her bond with Emily. And now, Emily had made her the sole beneficiary of her vast estate. Poirot's mind raced as he carefully examined the document. There were no signs of tampering, no visible ink smudges, no reason to believe that the will had been forged, yet the timing was all too perfect. Just before her death, Emily had rewritten her will to disinherit her family, a family already steeped in suspicion, and a family who would now stand to lose everything. The question now was, had Emily's family been desperate enough to kill her to prevent this new will from coming into effect? Poirot knew better than to trust appearances. There was something here, something more sinister than simple greed. As he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. A note written in Emily's delicate handwriting, scrawled on the back of the will. It was addressed to Minnie, and the words were sharp, urgent, and unsettling. "You are in danger, Minnie. They will stop at nothing to get what they think they deserve. Trust no one. Do not let them find you." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he read the note once more. It was clear now Emily had known the danger she was in. But had she feared for her life because of her family's insatiable desire for wealth, or had it been something deeper? Had Minnie truly been in danger from the moment Emily had made her decision? Just then, the sound of footsteps outside the study door broke his concentration. Captain Hastings entered, his face grim. "Poirot," he said in a hushed voice, "I've found something else, something that might be connected to the will." Poirot raised an eyebrow, signaling Hastings to continue. Hastings handed him a small, yellowed envelope. Inside was a letter, written by Emily just days before her death, this time to her lawyer. The letter was brief but alarming. "Please, make sure the will is executed immediately after my passing. I cannot trust anyone in this house anymore." Poirot felt a sense of dread coil in his chest. Emily had known that something was coming, and now it was painfully clear. Someone in this house had a reason to kill her, a reason to destroy the new will before it could take effect. Cliffhanger. Poirot's fingers lingered over the letter, his thoughts racing. Who had killed Emily, and why? Was it the relatives, who stood to lose everything to Minnie? Or was it someone closer to Minnie herself, someone who had been waiting for Emily to slip up, to make one last mistake before the will went into effect? One thing was certain. Emily's death was no accident, and the new will was the key to unlocking the mystery. Poirot was now facing a race against time. Someone would stop at nothing to keep the new will from being revealed, and it was up to him to uncover who and why. Did someone murder Emily to keep her will from becoming official, Or was Minnie herself caught in a dangerous game far darker than Poirot could have imagined? The game of secrets and lies had just begun, and Poirot was determined to follow it to its shocking conclusion. Strange clues and twists. It was an old house, its dark, winding halls whispering secrets from long before Emily's death. The grand staircase was the heart of the mansion, but it was also where Emily had met her untimely fall. Despite the hours Poirot had spent examining the scene, something was still off, a sensation that had gnawed at him since his arrival. There was more to Emily's death than met the eye. Poirot stood at the top of the stairs again, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the grand staircase, his mind working in perfect synchrony with the surroundings. His gaze landed on something small, nearly hidden in the shadows beneath the worn wooden railing. A single varnished nail gleamed against the dark wood, so faint, so out of place, his breath caught. "A tripwire," Poirot murmured, his voice soft but filled with conviction. It was a subtle mechanism, one carefully placed to make sure that Emily's fall wasn't an accident. The polished varnish suggested it had been recently installed, a precaution taken to ensure her tumble would appear like a simple misstep. Yet it was clear now someone had orchestrated her fall, someone with a hand so subtle and calculated that even the most astute mind might miss it. Poirot bent down, his gloved hand brushing the nail carefully. The trap had been set, but the question remained. Who had placed it there? Was it someone in the household? Or was it someone more elusive, hiding in the shadows? As Poirot examined the nail, Captain Hastings approached, his face pale and troubled. "Poirot, I think you should hear this," he said quietly, holding up a piece of crumpled paper. Poirot glanced up, intrigued, as Hastings unfolded it. It was a note written in Emily's distinctive handwriting, the ink slightly smudged, as if it had been written in haste. "Bob was outside all night. He couldn't have been the one to push me, but I know now. Someone here wants me dead." The words seemed to pulse with a raw, desperate truth. Emily's fox terrier, Bob, had been outside the house the night of her fall, meaning the dog couldn't have been the one to have caused her to slip, as some had initially believed. But Emily's words revealed something even darker. Her final moments weren't just spent in terror, but in the realization that someone in her household had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Poirot's mind raced. This small note, the varnished nail, the strange behavior of the family members, everything was beginning to fall into place. Emily had suspected that the fall wasn't a mere accident, and now Poirot had proof. But the deeper question haunted him. Who would benefit from her death? Who had been lurking, setting the trap in plain sight? Poirot straightened, his gaze flicking toward the doorway. Hastings was waiting for his verdict, but Poirot remained silent for a long moment. The pieces had shifted. The game was no longer simple. The truth was more complicated, more dangerous than he had imagined. The air in the house seemed to grow heavier, darker. There was no going back now. The investigation had entered a new phase, and Poirot's mind was sharper than ever. Every glance, every conversation, every gesture now carried the weight of suspicion. The killer was still among them. The trap had been set, and Poirot was closing in. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot turned sharply, a new thought piercing his mind like a sharp needle. The tripwire, he muttered, was it intended for Emily, or was it meant for someone else entirely? The question hung in the air like a thick fog. Could it be possible that Emily wasn't the true target? Was there someone else in the household that the murderer wanted to eliminate first, and was Emily's death merely an unfortunate consequence of the killer's mistake? Poirot stepped back, his eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. "Hastings," he said, his voice steady, "we must speak to Minnie Lawson immediately." As Poirot turned, Hastings looked confused but followed, and in that instant, the trap seemed to close tighter around them all. The truth was within reach, but the next twist could prove even deadlier. Who was truly the intended victim of the tripwire? Was Emily's death part of a bigger scheme, or had she been the final target after all? Poirot's eyes narrowed as he thought of Minnie Lawson's peculiar role in all of this. The answers were getting closer, but with each clue, the danger grew ever more real. During the séance, The night had fallen thick and heavy over the mansion, draped in an eerie fog that seemed to crawl up the ancient walls. The air inside the drawing room was no less oppressive, charged with an unsettling energy. It was the perfect night for a séance. The family, desperate for answers and perhaps more willing to believe in the supernatural than Poirot, had gathered around the round table, each of them casting wary glances as they attempted to contact the spirit of the late Emily Arundel. The medium, a woman named Madame Serena, had come highly recommended, though Poirot had never been one to believe in such occult nonsense. His skepticism was well known, and he watched the proceedings with a critical eye, his gaze sharp, studying every movement of the participants. Captain Hastings sat beside him, visibly uneasy, but Poirot gave no sign of his own discomfort. As the séance began, the room plunged into a heavy silence. Madame Serena closed her eyes, her voice rising in a soft chant. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but within the room, there was only the sound of Serena's low murmurs and the occasional creak of the house settling. Poirot remained still, his eyes never leaving the medium. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to break the tension in a way that would defy explanation. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped, an unnatural chill spreading through the room. The candles flickered, their light casting long, shuddering shadows. And then, without warning, the witnesses gasped in collective horror. A faint but unmistakable glow seemed to emanate from Emily's chair at the far end of the table. The light was subtle at first, like a soft mist, just at the edge of their vision, but soon it intensified. It began to swirl, almost as if it were alive, dancing and pulsating. The room was filled with a strange, shimmering aura, a luminous mist that hovered around the chair. And then, as if summoned by an invisible force, the glow shifted and seemed to take shape, focusing around the mouth of Emily's chair, where an ethereal light glowed as if drawn from deep within the spirit world itself. The witnesses were frozen, mouths agape in disbelief. Even Captain Hastings, who had tried to keep his composure, had gone pale, his breath shallow and fast. "Monday Dieu," he whispered under his breath. "What is this?" Poirot leaned forward, his mind racing. He had seen many things in his career, but this was new. This was something that even he could not immediately explain. His sharp eyes followed the glow as it danced above the table, mesmerized but also calculating. Could this be some trickery, a clever deception, or was it something more, something beyond the reach of logic? Madame Serena's voice wavered, her words trembling as she spoke. Emily Arundel, can you hear us? Speak to us from the other side." The medium's hands were raised, as though in prayer, as the luminous aura seemed to pulsate stronger, answering her call. Poirot remained unfazed, his mind working at lightning speed. The glow was undoubtedly real, but the question was, what did it mean? Was this truly a supernatural event, or was there a far more rational explanation behind it? Poirot had always placed his trust in science, logic, and observation, and he would not be swayed by appearances. But something gnawed at him, a disturbing thought that refused to let him go. Could there be a scientific explanation that he was overlooking? As the glow continued to pulse and ebb, something caught Poirot's attention. Beneath the mystic light, he noticed a faint shape, the outline of a small, indistinct object. It appeared to be coming from Emily's mouth, as if something was being expelled from her lips, even in death. Poirot's heart raced. Suddenly, the light flickered and vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Silence fell over the room, as though the air had been sucked out of it. The witnesses sat frozen, staring at one another, too stunned to speak. Poirot was the first to break the stillness. "This, my friends," he said, his voice cool and deliberate, though his mind was whirring with possibilities, "is not something I have encountered before." He turned to the group, his gaze intense. "But do not let your imaginations run wild. There is always an explanation. This aura, as you call it, is but another clue, and I will find the truth behind it." He turned toward Captain Hastings. "We need to examine every inch of the room, every item, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant." Cliffhanger ending. But just as Poirot was about to move forward, a voice faint but clear echoed through the room, its source unclear. "Find the ring," the voice whispered, the words hanging in the air like an echo from the beyond. Poirot froze. His mind quickly raced through all the clues he had uncovered so far. The will, the secret messages, the mysterious tripwire, but this was something new. A ring. Could it be the key to unraveling everything? Was the luminous aura a sign of something supernatural, or had Poirot just uncovered another layer of deception? The whispering voice had given him a new lead, but would he be able to decipher it in time to uncover the truth behind Emily's death? And what was this mysterious ring that had been alluded to? The investigation was taking a turn toward the inexplicable, and Poirot was determined to get to the bottom of it. But could his brilliant mind outpace the dangers now closing in around him? The murderer strikes again. The night had descended on the mansion like a heavy blanket, the weight of impending danger hanging in the air. Bella Tanios, her face pale and drawn with fear, had taken a drastic step. Fleeing from her oppressive and dangerous marriage, she had secretly gathered her children and sought refuge in one of the guest rooms. Her hands trembled as she locked the door, her mind racing with the terrifying realization that her life and the lives of her little ones were in grave danger. Her thoughts kept returning to the strange events of the past few days. First, the haunting message she had received, warning her that her life was in jeopardy. Then, Emily's untimely death, which Poirot had insisted was no accident. Bella had heard whispers of a killer among them. But who could it be? Was it the cunning Charles, or the dangerous Teresa? Or worse, could it be someone closer to her husband Jacob? In the darkness, she clutched her children tightly, knowing she was vulnerable. Her heart pounded as the night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the oppressive atmosphere thickening around her. She barely slept, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every faint sound outside the room. She could not shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Meanwhile, Poirot, ever vigilant, had moved Emily's timid companion, Miss Minnie Lawson, to a safer location. The quiet woman had no idea of the extent of the danger she was in, but Poirot understood the gravity of the situation. Too many strange occurrences had linked the deaths to those closest to Emily, and now, with Bella's sudden flight from her husband, Poirot feared the worst. With his characteristic precision, Poirot surveyed the mansion, making mental notes of every shift in atmosphere, every flicker of light that felt slightly out of place. Every step he took was cautious, measured, as though he were walking a thin line between revelation and peril. The stakes had escalated. A killer was in their midst, but who? As the hours passed, Poirot couldn't help but feel that the walls were closing in. There was a sense of urgency now. Bella, who had once been a central figure in the family drama, was no longer simply a worried relative. She had become a target. The feeling of impending doom was inescapable. And then, the very next morning, the news came. Bella was dead. The news hit like a bolt of lightning. Poirot, who had spent the night in quiet contemplation, rushed to the guest room where Bella had been staying. The door was unlocked, and inside, the air felt still, too still, as though the very room itself was holding its breath. Bella's lifeless body was sprawled on the floor, her face pale and frozen in an expression of terror. A small glass bottle of sleeping pills was found beside her, the label worn and faded. The family physician, Dr. Granger, was the first to arrive on the scene. His face was grim as he examined the body, confirming that Bella had overdosed on sleeping pills. "It's tragic," he said, his voice heavy with false sympathy. "A case of self-inflicted despair. She must have been under so much stress." But Poirot, standing in the doorway, wasn't convinced. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, noting the details that others missed. Bella had been frightened, yes, but she wasn't the type to end her own life. There had been no indication that she was suicidal, no signs of a mental collapse. The very fact that she had taken such drastic measures to protect her children only hours before made the idea of suicide seem improbable. Poirot's mind churned, piecing together fragments of evidence, piecing together a story that didn't add up. The room was neat, too neat. Bella had been in a hurry, but her actions had been far too deliberate. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of panic. It seemed calculated, as if someone had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. But who? Poirot's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but there was one question that gnawed at him. Why had Bella been targeted? Was she simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time? Or had she uncovered something she wasn't meant to? Poirot bent down and examined the sleeping pills more closely. The bottle had been opened recently, the cap slightly askew, as if someone had tampered with it. This wasn't a suicide, this was murder, made to look like a tragedy. As Poirot stood up, Captain Hastings entered the room, his face ashen with shock. "Do you think it's the same person?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with dread. Poirot's gaze shifted, his expression steely. "We must consider all possibilities, Hastings. Bella knew too much. She was close to the truth, and someone did not want her to live long enough to expose it." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot stared at Bella's body, something caught his eye, a small, almost imperceptible mark on the underside of the chair. A faint, fresh scratch, as if someone had recently run their fingers across the wood. But there was something strange about it. It was too deliberate, too careful. Was this a clue? Or had the murderer been trying to leave behind a signature, an unsettling reminder of their power? Poirot stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing. This was no random act of violence. The game was changing, and someone in that house had just taken a dangerous leap toward the truth. Who would be next? The final revelation. The grand drawing room was a picture of eerie stillness, a place where secrets had been concealed for years. The high, ornate ceilings seemed to watch over the assembled group, their gleaming chandeliers casting long shadows that twisted unnervingly in the flickering candlelight. It was here that Hercule Poirot had summoned the key players of this sinister drama, the suspects who had unwittingly played their parts in the death of Emily, and now the shocking truth was about to be revealed. Poirot stood at the front of the room, his back straight, his eyes gleaming with quiet confidence. Beside him stood Captain Hastings, his face drawn, still struggling to comprehend the twists of this horrific case. The room was thick with tension as the suspects sat nervously in their chairs. Each one was bracing for the moment that Poirot would reveal the killer among them. The air was pregnant with anticipation. Charles, the charming but desperate nephew, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously at his aunt's ornate portraits on the wall. Teresa, the glamorous yet dangerous niece, fidgeted with the hem of her dress, her lips painted a deep red, a stark contrast to the pale, drained look on her face. Bella's husband, the brooding Jacob Tanios, sat still, his eyes hard, his knuckles white from gripping the armrests. And then there was Miss Minnie Lawson, the unassuming companion, who had been dragged into the web of deceit without her consent. All of them were suspects. All of them had their own motivations. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, and he began to speak, his voice calm yet filled with quiet intensity. "Monday, amis, you are gathered here today because Emily's death was no accident. You all suspected one another, pointed fingers, but the truth was hidden in plain sight. Allow me to enlighten you." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air, before continuing. "It is not Teresa, it is not Charles, nor even the misunderstood Minnie. The killer was Bella Tanios." A collective gasp filled the room, and the faces of the assembled suspects froze in disbelief. Bella, the woman who had fled from her husband, the one who had been so desperately afraid. It seemed impossible. But Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered, and the revelation began to unfold. Bella, he explained, had lived a life shackled by her cruel, domineering husband, Jacob. Her marriage had been nothing but a prison, a torment that drove her to the edge of despair. But Emily's fortune and the new will had presented her with an opportunity, an escape from the oppression she faced every day. However, when she discovered that Emily had changed her will, leaving everything to Minnie Lawson, Bella panicked. She saw her future slipping away once again. Her marriage to Jacob was a torment she could not bear, and now, with Emily's death, the inheritance would fall into the wrong hands. Minnie's the meek companion who could never understand what Bella had endured. In her desperation, Bella concocted a devious plan to make Emily's death appear natural, to erase any trace of foul play. She poisoned Emily with elemental phosphorus, a substance so powerful, so insidious, that it mimicked the symptoms of liver disease. It was genius in its simplicity, and for a time it worked. Emily's death appeared to be nothing more than an unfortunate, natural event. But Bella's plan hadn't ended there. The glowing aura that was seen during the séance, that was no ghostly apparition. It was the result of the phosphorus poisoning, a glowing effect that had been described in ancient cases of poisoning with the element. The very thing that had killed Emily had caused the strange, eerie glow that captivated everyone during the séance. Poirot had been fascinated by it, and now he knew that the answer had been right in front of him all along. And yet, Bella's panic had not subsided. Upon discovering the change in the will, Bella's fears reached a boiling point. The inheritance, the very thing she had hoped to control, was slipping further from her grasp. In her desperate bid for freedom, she plotted to kill her husband next. Jacob, the man who had kept her imprisoned for so long, would be her next victim, but fate had other plans. In the midst of her plotting, the guilt, the fear, the pressure had become too much. Bella had made one fatal mistake. In her haste, she had swallowed the very same poison she had intended for Jacob. Her death was not an act of suicide, as some had thought. No, it was an accident, a result of her own twisted design. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he turned to the stunned faces in the room. It was not a crime of passion, but a crime of desperation. Bella Tanios thought she could escape her torment, but in the end, she sealed her own fate. The room was silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of a distant clock, a reminder that time was running out, and the truth had finally been revealed. But Poirot was not finished. As he spoke, his gaze flickered to the family portraits on the wall, the silent witnesses to all the deception. There was something more, something Poirot had been pondering ever since the first twist had emerged. A dark secret still lingered in the shadows of the family's history, one that had yet to come to light. Poirot turned to face the group once more, a gleam of mystery in his eyes. But there is still one question left unanswered. What other secrets lie buried within this family? What truths have been hidden for far too long? The room tensed. The walls themselves seemed to close in, and for the first time in their lives, the suspects realized that the mystery was far from over. What other dark truths lay in wait, ready to be uncovered? Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot left the room, a cold shiver ran down everyone's spine. The case seemed to have been solved, but Poirot's words echoed in their minds. What other secrets were hidden within the family? Could this have been the end, or was there more to uncover? As the room fell into an oppressive silence, a sudden knock echoed from the grand front door, a sound that no one expected to hear at such a late hour. Who could it be? What more could there possibly be to uncover? The aftermath, emotional closure. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting a soft golden glow over the village as Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings stood at the edge of Emily's once grand estate. The air was thick with the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded, the darkness now lifting, yet the emotional scars would never fully fade. Poirot's sharp mind had unraveled every twisted knot of deceit, but the emotional toll on the family, and on the innocents caught in the crossfire, was something not even his meticulous reasoning could erase. Inside Emily's vast, echoing mansion, the will had been read, and the reality of Emily's final wishes began to take shape. Miss Minnie Lawson, the timid companion who had so often been overlooked, now stood in possession of Emily's fortune, but Poirot had ensured that Emily's desires were honored in the most meaningful of ways. The inheritance would be divided, but not as Emily had originally feared. Miss Lawson, despite her quiet nature, had expressed a deep compassion toward the family members, those who had suffered at the hands of Bella's cruelty, those who had been blinded by their own greed. With a heavy heart, Minnie had chosen to share Emily's wealth. Teresa, the glamorous niece, whose reckless lifestyle had been the cause of much of the turmoil, was the first to receive a portion. Despite her outward confidence, Teresa was a woman trapped in her own desperation, and now she would have the means to escape the clutches of her vices. Charles, the charming but broke nephew, who had only ever seen Emily as a source of wealth, was given a smaller portion, a cold reminder of how his self-centered ambitions had led to nothing but ruin. And then there were Bella's children. It was the most difficult decision of all, how to deal with the legacy left by a mother whose choices had destroyed so many lives. But Poirot, with his quiet wisdom, had urged Minnie to give them a chance, to let them rebuild their lives outside of their mother's shadow. They were not to blame for Bella's actions, and it was the least that Emily's spirit could hope for. In the dim light of the evening, Poirot sat with Hastings on the steps of the mansion, Bob the fox terrier curled up at their feet, his soft breathing a small comfort in the otherwise still night. Poirot's eyes remained distant, his thoughts far away. Yet the weight of the case hung heavy in his heart. They had solved the mystery, yes. They had unraveled the tangled web of greed and betrayal, but the personal cost had been steep. The family, fractured by ambition, guilt, and loss, would never be the same. "It is often the case, Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice heavy with sadness, "that greed is the poison that destroys a family. But it is also the thing that blinds them to what truly matters. The real tragedy, mon ami, is not the death of Emily, but the lives that were wasted in pursuit of something as fleeting as money." Hastings nodded quietly, his eyes following Poirot's gaze as it rested on the estate in the distance. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood empty, a cold monument to the things that had gone wrong. A sudden rustle in the trees caught Hastings' attention, and he turned quickly. A shadow had moved near the edge of the property, too quick to be a figment of their imagination. Poirot's sharp gaze flickered over, his hand instinctively tightening around the small leather pouch that always hung at his waist. He had been on edge ever since the case, had concluded something still didn't feel quite right. "Did you see that, Hastings?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but his eyes narrowed, searching the distance. Bob the fox terrier raised his head, sensing the change in the air, his tail wagging nervously. "It's nothing," Hastings replied, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "Just the wind, perhaps." Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, his movements precise and deliberate, as he studied the silhouette in the shadows. For a moment, the figure appeared to disappear into the trees. Then, as if on cue, it reappeared closer now, just at the edge of the garden. The figure was no longer a distant, blurred shape, but something far more tangible. Hastings stepped forward, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. "Poirot, should we?" Poirot's sharp whisper cut through the growing tension. "No, Hastings. Let us wait, for there is still something hidden here, something we did not uncover, a final truth that lies beyond the reach of the living." Just as Poirot's words hung in the air, the figure turned sharply and vanished into the night, leaving only the faintest echo of movement. Poirot remained silent, his gaze focused, unblinking. Bob the fox terrier, now fully alert, began to bark urgently, snapping Poirot from his trance. Poirot looked down at the dog with an almost imperceptible smile, though his mind was clearly preoccupied. "It is not over yet, Hastings," he said, his voice quieter now. "The truth sometimes is far more elusive than we ever imagine." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot and Hastings stood frozen in the gathering twilight, a shiver of uncertainty passed through the air, leaving them both with a gnawing sense that their adventure was not quite finished. A figure in the shadows, was it an innocent wanderer, or someone who had returned to finish what had been started? The mystery of Emily's death had been solved, but the last few moments had shaken Poirot to his core. What else had they missed? The chill in the air, the sudden movements in the dark, the sense that something or someone was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. With a final glance at the mansion behind them, Poirot's voice broke the silence, carrying the weight of 1,000 unsolved mysteries. "The end, Hastings? I think not. There is still one chapter to be written." As the first star of the evening twinkled faintly above them, it was clear. The case was over, but the story was far from finished.